And good morning. I'm Don Burke with the Environmental Stewardship Initiative, and I will be your moderator today. I want to welcome you to today's webinar on the Solvent Contaminated Wipes Exclusion Rule and Vendor Responsibilities. Also assisting with this webinar is the manager of the ESI program, Angela Barger, and our section chief, Marcia Olaco. We would be remiss if we didn't thank the Waste Reduction Partners and the Land of Sky Regional Council for hosting this webinar on GoToWebinar. They have been wonderful partners for us, and we have shifted so much of our outreach and training to an online format. Terry Albrecht, Section Chief of WRP, is assisting us today as well. Just a few housekeeping items before we dig into today's topic. If you have audio issues and are using the audio through your computer, you can switch to your telephone. Just go to the audio tab in the webinar controls box and click phone. A phone number and code will be shown for you to use to access the webinar. The call-in information is also in your webinar invite email. We are recording today's session. The link for the recording, PowerPoint slides, and associated handouts will be posted to the SIE events website for everyone to access. Check that out through our NCDEQ website, deq.nc.gov. Search for Learn About Divisions, and you'll see the Environmental Assistance, Environmental Stewardship the Environmental Stewardship Initiative website there. To prevent feedback and unintended background noise, all attendees are muted. However, we want you to ask questions and share verbally. So in order to facilitate that, we'll ask you to raise your hand when you want to speak. Be sure to mute yourself only through the GoToWebinar software using the little microphone button at the top of the control bar. It will be red when muted and green when live. It should default to muted, and we can unmute you to speak. But to reduce time fumbling through the controls, make sure you do not use your phone or computer to mute. Now, if you do not necessarily want to speak, but you still have a question or comment, we encourage you to submit those through the questions box anytime during the webinar. We will share these questions and comments after the presentation, as the remaining time will indeed be dedicated to your questions. For those of you who are not familiar with our program, the Environmental Stewardship Initiative is a voluntary assistance and recognition program. It has been part of DEQ since 2002 and is administered by the Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service. We are partially funded by an EPA pollution prevention grant and promote environmental management systems, programs, no, I had it right, systems, to assist organizations in their efforts to continually improve their environmental footprints. We also encourage and facilitate networking and training events that allow for peer sharing between our members on a wide range of environmental topics. If you are not yet a member and would like more information, please email Angela Barger or I. Our contact information is on the screen. We would be happy to share more information with you and answer any questions that you might have. There is no cost to join, and all we ask is an annual report on the progress made toward your environmental goals. Now here's a fun splash screen showing many of our members. We'd love for you to be on the slide. We would like to thank Terry Albrecht and the Waste Reduction Partners for assisting ESI staff by providing our outreach today via the GoToWebinar, and also their partners, the Land of Sky Regional Council. WRP and ESI are both part of the NC Department of Environmental Quality, which has a mission to support pollution prevention strategies and is actively promoting hazardous waste and hazardous material reductions. Terry's contact information is on the screen. Feel free to reach out to him for more insight to the program. We are very grateful for the NCDEQ's Division of Waste Management's Hazardous Waste section once again presenting a hazardous materials roundtable event. The primary purpose of the hazardous waste section is to prevent and reduce releases of hazardous substances and clean up contaminated sites. The hazardous waste section ensures the safe management of hazardous waste in North Carolina. The staff applies the adopted federal rules that incorporate the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act requirements and additional state rules. Be sure to check out the program located on this NCDEQ DWM website. Now today, the following hazardous waste section staff are joining us on the webinar. Jenny Patterson, Rose Pruitt, Jeff Menzel, Dan Gerdner are with us today for the presentation on the Solvent Contaminated Wipes Exclusion Rule and vendor responsibilities. Jenny will be the primary speaker today, with Rose, Jeff, and Dan joining in on the panel. But before we get started, we're going to conduct a few polls to learn a little more about our audience, which is you. Angela?
Okay, the first poll is up now, so if you can tell us what best describes your organization's hazardous waste generator status.
We'll take about 20 to 30 seconds with this, and we'll check out the results.
Okay, looks like most everyone has voted, so I'm going to close it. There you go, and there are your results.
Okay. I can't see the results.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
So,
yeah.
You've got about 35% are large quantity generators, 30% are small, 15% are very small, and then you've got about 20% that are not generators of hazardous waste.
Gotcha. And I could read it. I was just reading the control bar wrong. So thank you, Angela. So thank you, everybody, for participating in that. Let's check out the second poll.
All right. And so we can learn a little bit more about you guys. Tell us what best describes the sector that you work in. All right, looks like just about everybody has voted. So let me close that.
Like we have an overwhelming majority for manufacturing industry, 65%. Okay.
Yep. All right. There you go.
All right, that it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see. Just switching controls over here. So with us today as our primary presenter is Miss Jenny Patterson. Jenny has worked with NCDEQ for 23 years, and 17 of those years with the hazardous waste section. She's been with us many times before. We'd like to thank her again for her participation. Jenny, it's all yours.
And are you seeing my screen?
Yes, I am. I hear you fine, and you're in full screen.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. Thank you very much to the Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service for hosting this roundtable, and to Don Burke for coordinating the event today and having us here. We always appreciate the opportunity to discuss the hazardous waste requirements and are grateful that you have offered us a format to provide information and also receive feedback, which is really helpful to us. So today we're gonna go over the Solvent Contaminated Wipes Exclusion and vendor responsibilities. But first I would like to introduce some folks. So we're really fortunate to have three excellent hazardous waste section inspectors join us for this roundtable today. I'd like to take a minute to introduce my esteemed colleagues, and if they want to pop on camera and say hi, you're welcome to, or you don't have to if you don't want. I'm going to start with Jeff Menzel. He's worked with the hazardous waste section for 5 years, and before that he worked with the Division of Air Quality. Hey, Jeff. Where he worked for about 8 years, is that right? He's located in the Asheville area and covers 17 the westernmost counties in the state. So he'll be the first to see snow. And Jeff has a degree in environmental science and enjoys mountain biking and fly fishing. Thank you for joining us today, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for letting me be here.
And we also have Rose Pruitt with us today. I think she said that she wasn't going to be on camera, but you just imagine, you can imagine her. She graduated from Wake Forest University and has almost 20 years of experience as an inspector with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Previously, Rose was an inspector with the Water Resources and the Underground Storage Tank Program. She joined the hazardous waste section in 2017 and covers 10 counties in the central Piedmont area. Actually, I can show the map. So Rose covers this section and Jeff covers this section of the state, and Rose covers 10 counties in the central Piedmont. Rose has joined us for all the previous roundtable events, and she's the reason I keep coming back to these events. So thank you, Rose, for being here.
Thanks, Jenny.
And then we also have Dan Girdner with us today. Hey, Dan, has worked with the environmental industry for almost 20 years as a consultant on geotechnical exploration, testing, and quality control, with significant environmental monitoring, remediation, and compliance experience from hazardous waste and renewable energy projects before joining the hazardous waste section in 2019. He enjoys nature and science activities with his family. And as you can tell, thank you, Dan, for joining us. He covers Guilford County, which is a very busy, it's this county right in the middle, very busy and complicated county. So as you can see, we've got a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge with us today. I'm very thankful to have these inspectors join us today. They really are the brains and the people that do all the hard work. I just show up and I present some slides, but they are the ones that do all the work and definitely can help answer the questions. And please feel free, Dan, Rose, and Jeff, jump in if you want to add some information or stories, or if I misspeak, please correct me. So now I'm gonna focus on the slides. So okay, so now you should just be seeing slides. Here's a map. So if you leave with nothing else today, this is the map that shows the inspector regions. And there's a link at the bottom of the map. And if some time has passed, please go to this link. This will provide you with the most recent map, most current up-to-date version of the map. And if you leave with nothing else, these are the folks you call if you have questions. So please do not hesitate to contact your local hazardous waste inspector if you need follow-up or additional information. Okay, so now let's jump into the meat of the presentation, what you were really here for today. So the exclusion that we're talking about today, the solvent contaminated wipes exclusion, was effective in North Carolina in January 2014, and specifically added conditional exclusions for two types of wipes, reusable wipes and disposable wipes. This exclusion is optional to use, which means that a site has the option on whether to manage solvent contaminated wipes with this exclusion or do a waste determination, which could mean that you're managing them as a hazardous waste. Or if your waste determination turns out to be beneficial to you, it could be a non-hazardous waste. So at the bottom of the slide, there's some provision there. It provides the regulatory citations and information on the federal regulation that's incorporated by reference in our state hazardous waste rules. The important thing to note here, though, is the word conditional exclusion. And that's something that we're going to talk about today. This is a conditional exclusion, and a conditional exclusion provides an exclusion from the regulations, but only when conditions are followed. This conditional exclusion applies to specific wipes managed in a specific way. And there are three main parts, and we're going to talk about these and focus on them a little more because they're so important. So today we're going to review briefly the three main parts of this conditional exclusion. The fact that the waste must meet the definition of a wipe. The wipes can only be contaminated with specific hazardous waste to be eligible for the exclusion, and the wipes must be managed under specified requirements. A little tongue-tied there. If the conditions are not met, the material returns back to being a hazardous waste, and all applicable hazardous waste requirements must be met for the management and disposal of the wipes. So if you're using this exclusion, if you're interested in using this exclusion, it's really important to make sure that your wipes meet the definition of a solvent-contaminated wipe and that the conditions are met. And that's something we're going to talk about today as far as vendor responsibilities. But before I get into that, I want to make sure that the other parts of the definition and conditional exclusion are understood, just so we're on the same playing field. So this is what I propose to cover today. Even though we're starting with the presentation, let's make this informal. Please feel free to ask questions. Don't hesitate to jump in if you don't understand something. We don't have to follow a structured plan. If you'd rather just focus on one topic, we can go in any direction that you want here. And if you'd like to focus on something specific, just let me know. Or, you know, after the fact, if you need some more information, we can certainly provide it. So please, Jeff, Rose, Dan, please feel free to jump in if you want to add any information now, or especially during the discussion that we're going to have. So unless I hear anyone object, I'm gonna jump into the definitions. So like I said, this exclusion is very specific and only includes items that meet the definition of a wipe. And there is a definition for a wipe in the regulations, and it means a woven or non-woven shop towel, rag, pad, swab, made of wood, pulp, fabric, cotton, polyester blend, and other material. And there's also a definition for solvent contaminated wipe, but we're going to talk about that in a few slides. So here, we're going to look at what qualifies as a wipe and what doesn't qualify as a wipe. EPA has provided some guidance as to what qualifies and what does not qualify as a wipe. And the list, it's not all inclusive. This is not exhaustive, just some examples of common items that qualify and don't qualify. So the items that we most see it mixed in with solvent contaminated wipes is personal protective equipment, mostly gloves. And that would not qualify as a wipe. So it's something to pay attention to. Masks, aprons, lab coats, uniforms, clothing, mops, mop heads, floor mats, sponges also would not be considered a wipe. And the last one on the list is really interesting because EPA actually had this in a guidance document that mattresses would not be considered a wipe. And it just got me to thinking that that's not a usual thing that people would think would be a wipe. I just thought it was an interesting item that they had to address. But it specifically was in guidance. So things that would be considered a wipe, again, this is not all inclusive, but I included some things that would be the most common items that someone might think would be a wipe. So these are the items on the left that are considered a wipe, and that's kind of what we're focusing on today. So if you have an item that you think would be considered a wipe and you're not really sure, you can always contact your inspector and run it by them and see what they think, see if it would qualify to jump over the first hurdle to be able to use this exclusion. So what happens if the waste doesn't qualify as a wipe? So let's say it's a glove. The exclusion is very specific and only includes items that meet the definition of a wipe. So if you have a glove, it's not a wipe, so you can't use the exclusion. A waste determination must be made in accordance with waste determination regulation 40 CFR 262.11 and on any items that wouldn't be considered a wipe. And be sure not to mix any other items with the wipes unless you are certain that they are non-hazardous. And an inspector would probably ask if you're mixing anything else that's not a wipe in with those wipes, they're going to ask. And you're going to have to be able to provide some evidence that it would be non-hazardous or otherwise excluded. Okay, so moving on. I mentioned that there was a specific definition for solvent contaminated wipe, and this is where the rule really got a little confusing. It had a great intent, but it gets very complicated here. The first point is that the solvent contaminated wipe is a wipe that we just went over that definition after use or after cleaning up a spill. So the key here on the first part, after you determine it's a wipe, it's got to be used. So solvent contaminated wipes include wipes that are both preloaded with solvent and those that become solvent contaminated upon use. But either way, they've got to be used in some way. So that's one of the hurdles. And then the next three items are the most complicated thing about the solvent contaminated wipe. And we're going to break it down into three parts, and I'm going to explain them a little more in subsequent slides. So we're going to take this, we're going to take the first part. Well, that's weird. I had a, okay, so we're going to take the first part and break it down. So what does contains one or more of the FO1 through FO5 solvents or the corresponding P or U listed solvents really mean? That's a lot of words and a lot of regulations that are being thrown at you. This is what it means. So the wipes that are containing F1 through F5 or the corresponding P or U listed solvents are these. So these would be the solvents that could qualify. They're one of the bulleted items. So if you are using wipes that have these solvents on them, this exclusion may be for you. So we can help determine whether there's some more steps on whether or not the exclusion would fit what you're doing. But if you're using these solvents on a wipe, chances are you might be able to pursue using the exclusion. So the second item on this, it exhibits a hazardous characteristic when the characteristic results from a listed solvent. Again, what does that mean? So what that means is there's some of these solvents on the list that are both listed. So like for instance, benzene is an FO3 listed waste, but it's also listed for a characteristic of toxicity. But because it's a solvent, it's allowed to have this. Another one would be MEK. So it's listed for being an FO5 solvent, but it also has a toxicity characteristic that goes along with it. But these are okay, like this said, it exhibits a hazardous waste characteristic when the characteristic results from a listed solvent. So because of that, these 6 solvents are allowed to be on a wipe that's used and can still qualify or be eligible for the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion. Something to point out here is trichloroethylene is a special case. This under no circumstances can go to the landfill, so it can only be laundered. And we're going to talk about the requirements for that later, but just note that if you're using trichloroethylene on a wipe, it might limit your ability for disposal. And then the third point on the definition was that it exhibits only the hazardous waste characteristic of ignitability due to the presence of solvents that are not listed. So what this is saying is that the solvent that's a hazardous, if the wipe is contaminated with a solvent that's a hazardous waste only because it's ignitable, it might be, you could manage it under the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion. However, it might be worth, especially if the wipe no longer has free liquids and it's dry, performing a waste determination under 262.11. If the wipe's not ignitable and no longer a D001 waste, you might be able to manage it as a non-hazardous waste and not even have to go into the conditions of this exclusion. So that's something to consider. But these are the 3 criteria to be able to have a solvent contaminated wipe. So wipes that do not qualify are wipes that haven't been used, wipes that contain a listed hazardous waste other than a solvent, wipes that exhibit the characteristic of toxicity, corrosivity, or reactivity due to non-listed solvents or contaminants other than solvents, and this is saying it almost the same way, wipes that do not qualify for the exclusion if they're contaminated with corrosive reactives, and then non-solvent T-clip materials, like for instance, metals would be something that would keep you from being able to use this exclusion. And then also the trichloroethylene would not be able to qualify if those wipes were being disposed. So what happens when the waste doesn't qualify as a solvent contaminated wipe? So again, it's kind of like if it doesn't qualify as a wipe, the exclusion is very specific and only includes items that meet the definition of a solvent contaminated wipe. So if it doesn't, a waste determination would have to be made. And then again, remember, be careful about mixing items that would be a solvent contaminated wipe with items that are not a solvent contaminated wipe, because you might end up with a lot of hazardous waste. You'd have to be able to show that what you're mixing it with are non-hazardous or otherwise excluded. So, like I said, this is probably the most complicated part of this exclusion. And there's a flow chart that we can take a look at that goes through these steps, and it might help to break it down further for the folks that aren't really clear on how this exclusion works and what can be on that wipe in order for it to be eligible. So the scope of the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion, there are two types of wipes. So reusable industrial shop towel or rag that's contaminated with a hazardous solvent and it's sent for laundering or dry cleaning, they're not a solid waste. Disposable industrial wipes that are contaminated with hazardous solvents that are going to for disposal either at a landfill or an incinerator are not hazardous waste, provided conditions are met. And the beauty of this exclusion is if it can fall under either of these, the reusable or the disposable wipes, it wouldn't have to count towards a hazardous waste generation category. So if you generate a lot of them, you wouldn't have to count it towards your hazardous waste generator category. So I've got a couple of examples just to make sure that this may be something that is familiar to you or may not, but just to show some examples of this solvent contaminated wipes exclusion and how it works. So let's just say here's a scenario. You have an oil spill and you clean it up with absorbent wipes. Can the wipes be managed under the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion? So no, so the absorbent wipes could be a wipe, but what's on them doesn't qualify for the exclusion because they're not solely contaminated with a listed or ignitable solvent. So the site must determine whether they're non-hazardous or they may be able to be managed as an off-specification fuel and burn for energy recovery. But if someone wants to do that, I would check with their inspector first, just to make sure that it is just a fuel that would be on there. And I can provide you more information on that, the off-spec fuel and burning for energy recovery if you want some more information on that. Wipes with acetone are used to clean products before a finish is applied. Can these wipes be managed under the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion? Maybe. If the wipe is only contaminated with acetone and doesn't pick up a contaminant like metals from the cleaning process, it qualifies for the exclusion as long as the conditions are met. One other example or one other scenario that a lot of people are asking about right now is, if I'm using disinfecting wipes for cleaning at my facility, can I manage them under the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion? Again, the answer is maybe. So if the wipe is contaminated only with an ignitable solvent like isopropyl alcohol that is not listed, you might want to just consider performing a waste determination. And if there's no free liquid and it doesn't meet the definition of ignitability under 40 CFR 261.21, you could manage it as a non-hazardous waste. So if the wipe is contaminated with a corrosive cleaner, I know there's some bleach wipes out there, the exclusion unfortunately won't apply. So there's some limitations, and this is something that I know a lot of people are doing and thinking about. And at the very end of this presentation, the presentation that you'll be provided with has some frequent questions and answers about disinfecting and cleaning waste and wipes that are associated with them. So that might be helpful if you do have questions on this and we don't get to them today. So after the wipes are used at a site, they've got to be part of the exclusion. One of the conditions is that disposable wipes, there's a very specific way that they need to be disposed. As long as they don't have trichloroethylene and all the conditions are met, they must go to a municipal solid waste landfill that has a solid waste permit under RCRA subtitle D. So there's certain requirements that's got to meet. It could go to a hazardous waste landfill or a combustor regulated under the Clean Air Act, or a hazardous waste combustor. So it's interesting because a lot of people that want to dispose of these wipes are doing so either in a solid waste landfill because they're meeting the conditions, or an incinerator. I don't know of very many of these disposable, or I'm sorry, solvent contaminated wipes that meet the exclusion that are actually still going to a hazardous waste landfill. Reusable wipes are the ones that are laundered or dry cleaned, but when they're sent to the laundry or dry cleaning facility, the wastewater that's generated at that facility must comply with Clean Water Act permit requirements, either an NPDES permit or a pre-treatment permit where it's discharged to a local city or town or county, a municipal publicly owned treatment works. Something to point out here is in the past, prior to this exclusion, the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion, there was a less stringent policy in place with DEQ about laundered wipes. And essentially it was, if the wipes are being laundered and reused, that they were more of a product than a waste. Unfortunately, when we adopted this solvent contaminated wipe rule, that previous old DEQ policy for laundering wipes went away. So anyone that's doing laundering of wipes, they would either have to fall under this exclusion or they would have to be non-hazardous. And we're going to talk about the vendor responsibilities in a couple of slides, but that's just something to point out because I think some people think that that old DEQ policy might still stand, but it doesn't. So accumulation requirements, these are the requirements that the generator of the wipes would have to meet. So at the site that's generating them, the solvent contaminated wipes could not be accumulated for more than 180 days prior to being sent for disposal or cleaning. They need to be placed in they must be placed in a non-leaking closed container that's specifically labeled with the word solvent, excluded solvent contaminated wipes. And the container that they're placed in has to contain any free liquid should they occur. So the 180-day tracking can be done by marking the container with an accumulation start date or maintaining documents or shipments or an inventory log. So there's some flexibility on that. So here's some labeling examples. So it's got the words excluded solvent contaminated wipes as required. And then it's got some bonus information as far as how they're going to remove the free liquids. Here's some more examples of labeling, and the label itself must be marked. The picture on the right has some extra signage to distinguish between the reusable and the disposable wipes here. They have color-coded wipes to distinguish the difference. The white rags are the reusable and go to the laundry. The blue rags are disposed and go to the incinerator. You don't have to have that, but that's a great way to keep them separate and to train your folks on which rags go where, which wipes go where. But this extra signage isn't required. It's just the marking on the container itself that's required. If you have several different waste streams at your facility, it may be worth color coding system to help with the placement of the waste in the proper containers. So regardless, employee training would be really important. The system is only as good as the employees who implement it. So if they don't know how to do it right, there's probably going to be some problems. This container labeling would not be in compliance to be eligible for the exclusion. We see a lot of issues with container labeling, and that's probably the top issue we see with solvent contaminated wipes. Either that or they just don't meet the exclusion. We also see open containers with rags overflowing. That's another issue that we see. So remember, they've got to be closed and able to contain the free liquids. When they're in good condition, this would be considered an adequate container, and the lid would have to while it's being accumulated, needs to touch the surface of the container. So a pedal, a flame, the red can, the step can would be an adequate container to accumulate wipes. They do advise that it's not, if it was sealed, it would keep the vapors in better. So that might be something that you can think about, is having a gasket on top of the container to keep those, to keep the vapors from coming out. So the picture on the right is actually new or clean wipes. So if this was in a facility and they were new or clean wipes and not used wipes, this wouldn't be a violation. But if these were used wipes, not only is it not labeled right, it's not closed. So the free liquids, there must be no free liquids in the container prior to the solvent contaminated wipes being sent for cleaning or disposal. And then any free liquids that are removed need to be managed as a hazardous waste. So the no free liquids condition is defined in the definitions, and it's based on an EPA test method, which is the paint filter test method, to determine whether or not there are free liquids available or in the free liquids. There are records that are required to be kept by the generator, and this is only the generator that has to keep these. They have to keep the name and address of the laundry, dry cleaner, landfill, or combustor. So wherever it's going to be disposed of or laundered, they need to keep that name and address on site. Documentation that the 180-day accumulation time limit is being met also has to be on site at the generator site. Description of the process the generator is using to meet the no free liquids condition, and then documentation of claims that the materials are not solid waste or conditionally exempt also needs to be maintained on site. So those are pretty easy requirements. The hardest part is determining whether or not the solvent contaminated wipe is eligible for the exclusion. I was going to switch gears if we can, unless we have a ton of questions. I was going to switch gears and talk about the vendor responsibilities, which interestingly enough, they're not a lot.
Yeah, feel free, Jenny. We don't have any questions yet, so.
Okay, well, good.
Yeah.
I hope everyone's awake after their lunch. I hope I didn't just give you a really good nap time.
It's been awesome.
Okay, so we're back. We're talking about vendor responsibilities. So these are going to be the places where the wipes go to, and we mentioned this. So the generator has to ensure that the site that's accepting them has the proper permits. The site that accepts them they also have to have the proper permits. So it's in their best interest to be managing them properly, because if these sites that are accepting them and laundering them or disposing of them, if they're not managing them under the conditions, they could be an unpermitted treatment, storage, and disposal facility. So here, the end game of the solvent wipes is the disposal site for the disposable wipes. So on the left side of the slide, we went over this before. So the disposal site, if it's a landfill, it's got to have a solid waste, municipal solid waste permit under 40 CFR 258. If it's a hazardous waste landfill or a combustor, it's got to have the appropriate hazardous waste permitting for landfills or combustors. And then if it's going to an incinerator, it would have to have that Clean Air Act permit. And then on the flip side, if it's a reusable wipe, it would have to go to the laundry facility or dry cleaner that's got the NPDES permit or a pre-treatment permit under the Clean Water Act. So the requirement says it has to have the permit. It doesn't say they have to be in compliance with the permit, but my question would be, would you really want to be sending these to a facility that was recalcitrant or was not in compliance with their permit. So personally, I would say you'll want to send them to a place that's in compliance. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. So again, the sites that are laundering them, I mentioned this less stringent policy. So if someone went to their vendor who was laundering these solvent contaminated wipes and asked the vendor, tell me how you're managing solvent contaminated wipes, and they said, what? It might be that they think that they're still managing it under a non-existent policy. So that could be problematic. Okay, so requirements that go beyond the generating site. There is another guidance document that you're provided with on some of the PDF forms. One of them is a side-by-side, and it shows the requirements for the generators, requirements for the transporters, and the requirements for the disposal or laundering facility. And it's interesting because there are much fewer requirements for the transporter and the disposal site or the laundering facility, but they do have some conditions that need to be met. So solvent contaminated wipes must be, and this is how the rules stated, accumulated, stored, and transported in containers that are closed, non-leaking, and contain free liquids should they occur, and marked or labeled excluded solvent contaminated wipes. So the transporter would have to meet these conditions, and the place where they're stored prior to being laundered or disposed would also need to meet these conditions. They would also have to meet the free liquids condition. So typically the generating site, before these solvent contaminated wipes are transported, they have to meet the condition of no free liquids prior to transportation. Often, when it's received by a laundry facility or a landfill, there shouldn't be free liquids, or if there are, if they kind of got mashed down during transportation, if free liquids are there by the time it gets to the laundry facility, they would have to manage them as the generator of those solvents or free liquid solvents. So I do know that there's some laundry facilities that will put those wipes in a centrifuge, or they put rags in a centrifuge to get any additional solvents out, just so it's not in their waste stream. There shouldn't be a lot to begin with. If there are, it's a problem. Most of the laundries that do any additional solvent removal are likely to be a very small quantity generator, but it is something to think about and to look for. So if the laundries are removing the free liquids, they could be a hazardous waste generator and would also have to meet certain requirements. Solvent contaminated wipes transportation, they have to meet any applicable DOT regulations under 49 CFR 171 through 179 when transported. They are not a hazardous waste if the conditions are met. So that makes it interesting. There's really not, you wouldn't have to send them on a hazardous waste manifest. You might have to send them on a bill of lading, but certainly not a requirement that you would have to, as long as the conditions are met, they wouldn't have to go on a manifest. I just thought of something I wanted to let you know, and I totally, the thought just left my head, but it'll come back to me. Something to think about. So North Carolina has adopted the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion. And if you're sending these to laundries in North Carolina or sending them to landfills in North Carolina, they would still be excluded, or to an incinerator in North Carolina. Sometimes it goes out of state. So something to think about to ensure that you're in compliance is that if this is going out of state, make sure that state and any state that it's transported through has also adopted the exclusion. So this regulation has been around for a while in many states. You can see the surrounding states around North Carolina here have adopted the rule. So that's good news. That means that it could be used in those states, but you also want to check their state-specific requirements to make sure that there are no additional requirements that would have to be met above and beyond the federal requirements. And then finally, the implication of vendor violation. So like I've mentioned a couple times, the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion is conditional. So if the conditions are not met by anyone, the material returns back to being a hazardous waste, and all applicable hazardous waste requirements must be met. So if the vendor mismanages the wipes and doesn't meet the conditions for the exclusion, they could be considered an unpermitted treatment, storage, and disposal facility. So that could be detrimental even if your site was meeting all the conditions. So something to think about, and the importance of auditing them. And if it's okay, I've got a couple more slides about auditing suggestions, if I can move into that portion, unless we have other questions or.
No, the avenue's clear. Feel free.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you. So when I was thinking about this topic, the first thing that I think of, and I think most people think of this about auditing, is visiting a facility. And for instance, I'm going to use laundry facility as the example. So it's important to visit the solvent contaminated wipe vendor. And I certainly would. If you can, I would always go to any of your vendor sites. So any hazardous waste transporters, any non-hazardous waste management sites, any hazardous waste management sites, and at least see for your own with your own eyes what it looks like, because you can tell a lot about a facility when you actually go and look at it. And I'm going to tell you more about this, but I took some of these photos and ideas from another presentation about auditing hazardous waste transporters and vendors. So some of the information applies, some doesn't. And if you'd like to see that presentation, if you weren't at that DEECS roundtable, I'll certainly share it with you, or we can get that presentation out to you, because it did have a lot of really good auditing information. But specifically, if the site on the left told me that they were a commercial laundry or an industrial laundry, and I came to audit them, and this is the equipment that they had, the picture on the left, I would start asking a lot of questions. It would really make me worry. But you can create a really nice brochure and put some really nice pictures on a website, but it doesn't always show you what the facility actually looks like. So take that to heart. I would highly recommend actually going to a site. I've been trying to compile some documents that might be able to help you. This is one of them that you'll have in hand today. So you've got a deliverable item that shows the requirements that each of the generator, the transporter, and the landfill, laundry, dry cleaner, and incinerator would have to meet. The one item I don't have that I would like to provide to you is a checklist, and that is something that might be helpful. But really, the information is also in some of the documents that you'll have today. So in thinking about this topic, I started looking into commercial and industrial laundry facilities because it's something that I'm not very familiar with as far as the hazardous waste side of things. And it's interesting because when I started looking through our database, our hazardous waste generator handler database, not many of them are hazardous waste generators. So that kind of met with my assumption that they're probably very small quantity generators, if anything. There was one, I looked it up, that had, it was a compliance issue back in probably the early 2000s. So it was on record, but it was because of something that happened even before the solvent contaminated wipe issue. And it's also a very small quantity generator. So we don't have a lot of records about industrial laundries, and we wouldn't have any records on solid waste landfills. And we also wouldn't typically have records on incinerators. So it made me think, well, this might be a really hard thing to audit as far as looking at other regulatory programs that are looking at them. So I did provide, here's some information. We've got a public document repository for both waste management, where you could see landfill information, both permits and inspections. Division of Water Resources, public, their Laserfish system would have public documents for any of the industrial laundries that have an NPDES permit. So you could see inspections. I don't think there are any. If there are, they're very few and far between. I also looked on EPA ECHO, which is the enforcement and compliance history, and it actually provides information on air, water, and waste. And I didn't find a lot of information on the industrial laundries when I searched them. So I would like to think that that's because they're all in compliance, but I know that that might not be the case. So I also wanted to give you another resource, the RCRA Info Web. This is the public information for any of the hazardous waste information, and it also has electronic manifests and some financial assurance and publicly accessible documents for hazardous waste handlers. But like I said, this isn't going to be very useful for the laundry sites, unfortunately. So there's some tips if you do want to use this public document repository called Laserfish. Here's some tips on how to use it. This presentation is going to be provided, so you can use these links later. But I mentioned the EPA enforcement and compliance history website. And like I said, I searched several of these laundries in the state, and I couldn't find any information. But if it was out there, I wanted to show you what it would look like, because what I would do is use this and search a specific facility that I might be using or interested in using. This happens to be a hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facility. And I only picked it just because I know that it has records and I know that it's out there, and none of the laundries had any information. So like I said, this has Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, hazardous waste, Safe Drinking Water Act if it's applicable. And then it shows number of inspections, it shows violations. It's a really useful tool, I think, that might help you as far as evaluating these vendor sites. But really what I think would be helpful, I anticipate that most of these laundries and dry cleaners would, if they have a discharge, it's going to be a pre-treatment discharge. It's going to be a discharge that goes, it's regulated by a city, town, or county, and it goes to a municipal publicly owned treatment works. And there is a link. I wanted to provide this specific link, but on the DEQ, Division of Water Resources pretreatment section, on their front splash page, if you go down, there's a list of the municipal pretreatment contacts in North Carolina. And what you could do, if there is a site that you're interested in finding out more information about, you could try contacting that pretreatment contact for the city or county for where that laundry is located. And you could ask about their compliance history. I don't know if they would require you to do a Freedom of Information Act request. I'm not sure how they would be able to provide you with information, but it's at least a resource that you could get some additional information about. So like I said, I had trouble finding information, so I thought of some other resources that might be helpful down the road. Check the Secretary of State business registration, and I'm going to show you a couple of screenshots to see what that would look like. Check the county GIS and tax websites to see if the property is owned or leased, or if there are any delinquent taxes or liens on the property. Do internet searches on company name, address, owner information. I find a lot of interesting stories and news articles and information on social media about some of the hazardous waste sites I've dealt with. So it's always a good resource to see what's out there. So this is the Secretary of State's website. And what I was talking about here is the business entity search. And then when you look there, you can look at, I pulled up one of the hazardous waste transporters because I knew there was some information. It's older, but you can view their filings. And then here is something that kind of makes you think. They had a revenue suspension. So it might be one way to find out about sites or to gather information on whether or not, they might be able to meet the conditions of the exclusion, but they might be having some other issues. So it's something to look into. Look for some warning signs. These might not be the best things to think about looking for in 2020, because I think there's some places that are constantly circling the wagons right now. But look for places that might be complacent. They're not investing in new technology or new equipment. They don't focus on customer service. There's some places that just expand and they're too big. They are overexpanding. They are too diverse. They don't focus on one main thing and do it really well. Like maybe they're doing laundering, but they're laundering too many different components. Look for places that are doing a lot of layoffs, selling assets, or pension buyouts. Like I said, this probably isn't the best year to be thinking about that, because I think there's a lot of companies doing that. But in a good year, if you see a company that's doing these things, you can kind of think that something else is going on.
Hey, Jenny?
Yes.
This is Marcia. I just wanted to interject something as a prior Division of Water Resources, water quality employee that from a pre-treatment standpoint, even though all of the programs are delegated out to a local municipality, DWR does get copies of all the permits that are issued to those industrial clients of the pre-treatment programs. And there is a pre-treatment program coordinator in each of the DEQ regional offices. So if anyone on the phone is looking for some compliance from a pre-treatment standpoint, we can get you in contact with DWR staff that should be able to get you some more information.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. I'm really glad you mentioned that. That is really helpful. And I could even include the link. I'll get some more information in the presentation. Something that it might not apply so much to laundries, but especially at hazardous waste facilities, transporters, and disposal companies, I tell people to look for high employee turnover. Sometimes it means that people aren't trained properly. It's a little different with a laundry facility or a landfill. There might not be as many technical issues that they have to deal with, but it is something to take notice of. Ask questions. One of the questions I thought of pertaining to solvent contaminated wipes specifically would be, if you went to a laundry facility, ask them what they're laundering with your solvent contaminated wipes. If you happen to be sending your uniforms to the same site, do you really want those in the same batch? I don't know. It might be worth asking. So some other questions, and these aren't really environmental or compliance based, but it's more to gather information on their management. So like I said, they're not directly related with environmental compliance, but you can gain valuable information by asking other questions to gather data. So to understand the corporate culture, ask questions about hiring. If you found information about an incident online, I know sometimes laundries have fires, ask them about the incident or see if they'll reveal information about the incident. Ask if their routine, like are incidents routine? Are they having fires in their dryers all the time? So incidents happen though. This was more related to hazardous waste facilities, but it could also apply to a landfill or a transfer station or a transporter. The incident can happen. It doesn't necessarily mean that, and here, like it said, the hazardous waste transporter or treatment facility shouldn't be used. It's how do they respond to it? So their response matters, how they follow up, what they do to prevent it in the future. So here's something that would would be useful at a laundry or some other vendor facility is see what you see. And that's the importance of going to the site. So there's some indications that you can gather by their building maintenance. And I know that that's not always definitive, but roofs are very expensive to fix. If people aren't fixing their roof, it might be an indication of other issues. Is the equipment operable? Landscaping, again, doesn't have anything to do with environmental compliance, but if they're deferring maintenance and they're not keeping up with landscaping, they might not be doing some other things. They might be not training people, or might not be keeping up with other really important requirements. So when you go to a facility and you see things that are very well organized, it can, hopefully this is what you see on the brochure, and then when you go to the site, this is what it actually looks like. But sometimes the brochure looks really nice and you go to the site and it doesn't quite look like the pictures they've posted online. So people taking shortcuts or being frugal is not always an indication of financial problems, but it can be. Maintenance and purchasing are typically stopped or delayed when money is in short supply. And I know a lot of places are dealing with that this year. So seeing a facility can sometimes help you make decisions on whether or not you use a vendor. None of these were solvent contaminated wipe issues, but I just wanted to show some pictures of really bad facilities that should have been audited. Use extra caution if you use a broker that's brokering out your material and your waste. The reason why brokers have no liability. So be very careful about using them. Also be very cautious about going with the lowest bid of any vendor. So that is, and I guess the last takeaway message as far as auditing, do not solely rely on your instincts, but do your review and your research. If something that the facility or vendor is saying doesn't match up with what you're seeing, then something probably isn't right and you need to dig deeper. So sometimes the instinct or intuition picks up on odd or unusual or out of place statements. So do pay attention and do trust your instincts in the end. So it's probably, this is the information that I have. I do have some frequent questions. If we have no other discussion to go over, we could start going over some of those, but I wonder if we want to open up the floor to discussion at this point, or how do you want to proceed?
Yeah, the floor is open, but feel free to continue. And if any questions come through, we'll be glad to let you know.
Wow.
Yeah, you've been very complete. Yeah.
So this might be a good time if Don or Dan or Jeff or Rose have any comments, or do you have any thoughts or situations that you've had that have been a particular problem?
So kind of the simple thing, excluded solvent contaminated wipe doesn't mean it's excluded from all regulations. It's just, I guess, like you said, it's excluded from your hazardous waste generation, like monthly totals, if it's managed properly and it meets all the conditions. It seems like sometimes places think excluded means like it's not really having to be carefully managed. It's just kind of the thing that I would remind people of.
That's an excellent point.
Just but like you said, the training to make sure the employees realize like what excluded means, to making sure they have the red fire cans closed as appropriate. Just making sure that those things actually get put into the container and closed. We're still looking for the labels in the closed containers when we see those.
Yeah, and I would just add, Jenny, like you started the presentation with, contact your local inspector. Odds are, we know about the certain launders in the area. And And like Marsha was saying too, you know, there's usually a wastewater component or pretreatment component associated with these places, and your hazardous waste inspector, a lot of us do have experience with water resources, or, you know, at the very least, we can help you bridge that gap to find the right person. You know, so yeah, you know, reach out to us if you have any questions, you know, about certain solvents or you know, anything like that. We're happy to help.
And
The
Jenny,
only,
go ahead. Go ahead,
I
Rose.
was gonna say, the only thing I think I can add to that is maintaining the documentation, that paperwork part, the name and address of the laundry that you're sending it to, documentation that you're meeting that 180-day requirement, and a description of the process that you're making sure that there are no free liquids in there. And you know, again, remember, if your plan is to air dry these, then you're treating hazardous waste, and that's a big no-no.
And Rose, wasn't there also, I guess, the question of some places that were really compacting those rags into a container? You could also be getting into treatment areas there.
I think I do remember a site like that. That was one of yours, wasn't it?
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah, those are all really good points. So it does just solidify the idea of contacting the inspector. We do, and I meant to say this, we do offer compliance assistance visits. So it's an excellent opportunity, especially with this type of exclusion that is not used a lot or not used correctly sometimes, to talk to the inspector for sure. So very good points.
Jenny, this is Don. We have a couple of questions with audience with their hands raised and 2 in the questions box. If you'd like, I'll start with Connor. I'm going to unmute you. You have a question to pose? Well, I'm trying to unmute.
Hello,
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can,
Yeah.
Connor. Go right ahead.
So I have a question in terms of COVID cleaning. So let's say we have a corrosive bleach wipe, but the pH of the concentration that the wipe is saturated with would not denote it under RCRA hazardous characteristics. Just want to clarify that that would not be applicable to this discussion.
Yeah, and that's a good point. At the very end of this presentation, if you close your eyes, I can scroll down to those slides, because I think a lot of people have those. I just didn't want to scroll so fast it gave everyone a headache. So there's actually a whole category on, hold on just a minute, I can run through these real quick, but you're right on that the majority of the disinfecting wipes, unless they are alcohol based, wouldn't meet the so we do get this question a lot. When disposing of disinfectant cleaning chemicals, how do I know it's a hazardous waste? Cleaning chemical I'm using is a pesticide. Is it going to be a hazardous waste? And then I've generated waste from cleaning and it's contaminated with, it's contaminated or suspected to be contaminated with COVID-19. Is it a hazardous waste? So unfortunately, there's no single list of disinfectants that would be considered a hazardous waste. Just because it's a pesticide or contaminated with COVID-19 doesn't automatically make it a hazardous waste. Waste determination needs to be done, and sadly, you know, the steps of the waste determination would need to be done. But typically, if it's the corrosive based, if it's a bleach, there's not a liquid, so the corrosive definition doesn't apply to solids. And then you just want to make sure that you evaluate the waste to see if it picked up any contaminant, any metals, anything else. But you're right, those types of materials wouldn't be subject to the solvent contaminated wipe rule because the cleaner itself wasn't one of the F1 through F5 listed solvents, or something that's just characteristic for ignitability. So that was a long way to answer your question, and I apologize, but yeah, so some of these other, I'm using disinfecting wipes for cleaning at my facility. How do I manage them? They may be able to fall under the solvent contaminated wipe rule, but it's usually if they're only isopropyl alcohol. But even then, just because they would be characteristic only for ignitability, if they're no longer ignitable, they might be a non-hazardous waste. And this is where I think your question comes in. If it's contaminated with a corrosive cleaner, the exclusion can't apply, unfortunately. And then I've got one more wipe slide. I think a lot of people, since they're using wipes, it was just a reminder, don't flush the wipes. Just because the sewer system's not able to handle it. Okay, so that's my my public service. And oh, so something a lot of people are using these wipes for disinfecting. So something to think about is that there's a lot of things that sound like they're a hazardous waste, but they don't fall into our regulations. So medical waste is something that we've been getting a lot of questions about recently. And if you have questions about medical waste, I can refer you to the solid waste section and provide you with additional information if anyone has questions. Here's something else. What do I do with empty containers that held the cleaning products? If it meets the standard for an empty container, it could be placed in the trash. So use as much as you can for its intended purpose. And if it's, you can't remove any more from that container and no more than an inch remains in that container, you could likely put it in the trash. So here's the empty container requirements. So sorry for that digression.
Yeah, I hope this helps, Connor.
Yes, thank you for the clarification.
All right, thank you. And we have one other attendee with their hand open up. We'll go to Jennifer next, and then we have a couple in the questions box. And
Actually, Don, the questions in the box are from Jennifer and
oh, I'm misreading it. Silly me. Thank you, Angela. That's why you're on.
So I'll read Jennifer's question, and if she wants to chime in with some clarification while you try to unmute her, we can do that. So it says, Jenny mentioned earlier about potential problems happening at a vendor or downstream site after the waste left the original generating site. So if the waste no longer meets the exclusion later in the process, who is considered the generator? Is it the original generator or where the issue occurred?
I would say any time that hazardous waste is, so if the exclusion doesn't apply, it would revert back to the hazardous waste regulations. So it could be possible that the generator could still be liable. It's hard to track that though with these types of wipes. Do the inspectors have thoughts on liability?
I would just chime in that, you know, since it's cradle to the grave, if hazardous waste, if they can figure out where it came from, and it came from, say, you know, your original site, I don't know, maybe you got your name stamped on all your wipes, but that would be make you the original generator responsible for it. And I'm guessing that if it's something that's unidentifiable, then they trace it back upstream to the laundry, then there's a possibility that the laundry would become the generator. But for the most part, if they can identify it, it's going to go back to the original generator.
Jose, seems to me that sometimes these situations, you know, the fingers start pointing, and as more agencies become aware, they have to come in and follow up on their jurisdiction. So water or air or waste or solid waste. And I'm just thinking one time I was instructed to go to a facility because there was concerns about their operations just because it was possibly tied in with another, related industry that was having some issues to kind of backtrack where things were originating from. And so there wasn't a clear-cut connection, but it did. The place was due, for a regular inspection, but it did mean that my supervisor told me that it needed to happen sooner rather than later. So it's just kind of one of those things that once it starts, there could be a lot of activity as everybody tries to figure out what's going on and what applies to the situation to get things settled.
Just to, and I would just say, add to that that's why it's important that you find a reputable laundry for this, so that it doesn't come back to bite you after you think you've properly disposed of it.
And I don't know if it would specifically happen here, but say you're giving it to someone to dispose of properly, and then you get a call that we've found some containers in the woods, and the only identifiable mark on it was where it left your plant. There's nothing else for us to track down to. So that's where you want to have all your records in order, where you can show who you gave it to and things. But like if there's identifying marks on it, that's where somebody's going to start. And I don't know if that completely applies to this situation, but it's just part of maintaining your records and vetting your partners, your vendors.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I have always jokingly thought that incineration would be the way to go because it's hard to track after it's burnt up. Are there other thoughts on auditing or
Jenny, this is Don. I know one question was, what implications are there if the vendor is not handling the waste stream properly? In the end, who is responsible? And Dan kind of checked. Dan answered a little bit of this. If all y'all can find is name of facility, that's all they have to go on. But if you know what vendor's involved and what facility it came through, in the end of the day, how do you handle that?
Yeah, ultimately the laundry, if the requirements weren't being met, could be an unpermitted treatment, storage, and disposal facility. And then additionally, if they didn't have an EPA ID number, there would be a non-notifier. So that's a pretty big issue or violation. The laundry is likely keeping records of every single transaction they have, and they are tracking, even if there's not documentation, there's tracking of what's coming to the laundry by invoices, because even if people aren't tracking the shipments, the invoices can be very revealing. So ultimately, like Rose had said, it's if this exclusion isn't met, and this is something to not necessarily scare people, but just to make sure that they're doing their due diligence. If the condition isn't met, this is hazardous waste. So if the conditions aren't being met, and the generator ultimately is going to be liable for a lot.
Right, and it's kind of
but really
the liability.
Go ahead.
Say, like, if you're paying somebody to handle your waste properly, you want to check to make sure, like, one, you're getting what you're paying for, and then two, just to ensure, like I said, The incidences I was thinking about earlier, which I said are just kind of related. It's not like different departments are calling each other trying to figure out how to, catch everybody. It's just that like you call someone at water and be like, hey, this facility said they were, permitted for this. Is that, I can't find the permit. Is that the case? And they'll be like, no, actually they're not. So then they just, the regulatory circle has widened because you've got two enforcement agencies that have to reconcile, what's been discovered. So I would say, like, I think everybody that's in violation, it'll try to be resolved. And so you just want to protect yourself to make sure like you're sending it to the place you're supposed to, and then they're doing what they say they were going to do for you and what you're paying for. And then, if they don't, if they're not meeting those conditions, if you're worried about it, then you would need to find someone else.
Okay. Well, it's 2:52. We don't see any other questions or hand raises. So feel free to submit that if you'd like. I would like to remind everybody that there will be a survey to get your feedback when you exit. Please take a few minutes to complete it, as it helps us improve the SI and to make sure that we are offering information on topics in which you are interested. And again, the webinar slides, the link when that's established, and the handouts will all be made available to you. If you haven't seen the handouts, you should see it there in the control bar. There are 4 of them. Feel free to take a look at those and download them, but they will be also put on our ESI events page where we post past webinars and the information, whether it's hazardous waste or energy. Feel free to join that site. We've really cleaned that up and got it rolling, and we're pretty proud of it. And if that's, Jenny, unless you have any other thoughts and comments.
I was gonna, can I stop sharing and we can go back to your questions slide? Would that be okay, or?
Well, I've just been leaving yours up. So,
Okay.
but yeah, you can stop sharing. Let's see here.
I was also, you had an excellent point about, oh shoot. You had an excellent point about vendors, and sometimes the advice that vendors give is not actually appropriate or regulatorily accurate.
Yeah, one of the questions was, what if you're getting conflicting information? You think you're doing something appropriate, but your vendor's saying, don't worry about it. And, but you kind of need to worry about it, because in the end, you're going to be the one that might experience some heartbreak. So if you are getting conflicting information, then what's your advice on that? Of course, I always would lean towards the regulator, your inspector, and share the issues with that. And one of the original comments that got this webinar going was someone was getting conflicting information on their solvent contaminated wipes, the exclusion rule, and how they were labeling their drums. They were labeling appropriate, but the vendor was saying, nah, you don't have to do that. And that's what got this ball rolling.
Yeah, and I was just going to chime in, Don. This is Marcia, and Jenny, you can comment here. So the question was related to one of our, I think it was a member, was using a vendor. And so the vendor was saying that the drums that were being used to collect the solvent wipes were owned by the vendor and not by our member. And so I think they were looking for some guidance about the labeling of the drums, if the drums are the vendors and not the, like if you came on site and saw that a drum wasn't labeled correctly, and the facility you're inspecting says, well, my vendor, they say it has to be labeled this way. Who are you going to look to for compliance there?
Generator.
Yeah.
That's what I figured, but it's good for you guys to actually say it.
Yeah, way the rule's written, it says accumulated, stored, transported. So it can capture a lot of entities, but in that case, it sounds like it's being accumulated or stored at the generator site.
Yep.
So the
And then I guess,
liability,
yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
the liability would fall on the generator. Rose is right on.
Right. And then if it, for some reason, that changes by the time it gets to the launderer or the transporter, then they would be held accountable. Correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And as far as the advice, like Don said, I always feel free to contact us. And we get a lot of anonymous or hypothetical questions, or a friend of mine has this happening at their site. We're happy to answer all of those.
And from the ESI perspective, we are happy to serve as an intermediary as well. So if you send your coach or me or Don a question, we can forward it to Jenny and strip names off if you feel like that's necessary. I don't necessarily feel it's necessary with Jenny and this crew, but if you feel more comfortable doing it that way, we can do it.
But before we run out of time, thank you very much. Thank you to Jeff, Rose, and Dan. I really appreciate you participating. And thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, it's been great. I hope we can do this again real soon. All right.
All right.
Well, if there are no further questions, thank everyone for attending, and good health to you all. Thanks again, everyone.